Hey guys, this is a very special episode of the Ranveer Show. We'll be addressing the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Is World War III around the corner? What's the history of this entire crisis? What are the geopolitical angles? What's India's role in this entire crisis? For some reason, I feel like Indian media hasn't reported this scenario as much as it should. And who better than Abhijit Chavda to kind of give us a commentary on whatever's happening from a geopolitical perspective in the world today. This is TRS. Make sure you follow TRS on Spotify. Every episode of TRS is available on Spotify 48 hours before it's available anywhere else in the world. A very special geopolitical episode of the Ranveer Show, all about the Russia-Ukraine crisis, with the history, the present, and the future addressed by Abhijit Chavda. Enjoy. Abhijit Chavda, sir, welcome to the Ranveer Show again. For the first time, we're doing it remote because I think these times are super urgent and we had to get this episode out as soon as possible. Russia and Ukraine, sir, I feel it's not as reported in India as it should be. What's your take on it? What are you making of this whole situation?
Well, it's a very interesting situation right now, very complex, very fast-moving situation. What we are seeing right now, as of today, February end of February, what we are seeing is that the geopolitical analysts and observers and forecasters, the past 48 hours, they would not have slept much because so much is happening. So many events have happened just very recently, and things are moving very fast. So what we have seen is that President Putin of Russia has recently announced that his nation is going to recognize the independence of two breakaway republics, which are part of Ukraine, which is the two republics, which is Luhansk and Donetsk. So those two have been declared independent, and Russia has now recognized that. So that is tantamount to, in a way, annexation of some parts of Ukrainian territory. Of course, there is more that Russia is eyeing, and they have given a number of historical and other reasons to justify their claims on this territory. So that's what's happening right now. The NATO, the Americans are pushing back. They are very unhappy about it, but there's nothing it looks like they can do right now to stop this from happening. They don't want to see a war. Nobody wants a war. Wars are dangerous. They are destructive. So the Russians essentially have achieved something, a significant, not small territorial gain without resorting to war. They have been saber rattling and all that. And they used a certain timing. The Winter Olympics were happening in Beijing, in China, and the entire world's attention was focused there. At that time, they started this pressure point on Eastern Europe. The Chinese are also imparting some pressure on Taiwan. We know they have been escalating their incursions the past few months. So it looks like there has been this coordinated effort, a double pincer movement, a two-front war threat, the kind of threat that we in India face all the time. So the same sort of thing has been orchestrated by these two countries in cooperation with each other. And right now we are seeing that parts of Ukraine are now going into essentially de facto Russian control.
So one thing that came up in my research for this episode was the very, very complex history of domestic politics that are happening in that region. Usually when we do these kind of podcasts with you, we did one about the Afghanistan crisis in Hindi. And I know you went back to the 70s to begin explaining that. Now, in order for people to understand what's happening in Ukraine now, how far back do you really have to go? Because according to me, you have to go really, really far back. But so you're the historian, so I'll let you kind of begin the story in your own way.
So I think to understand the roots of this conflict, etc., I think we may need to go back 1,000 years. And I can make it fast. I don't want to go into great detail. We need to consider what's happening right now. But to understand the history of why this conflict happens, we have to go back to the roots of the Russian people. So the Russian people are, well, I think I should go back 2,000 years and make it very brief. So the Russian peoples are a Slavic people. Now, the first historical attested record of the Slavic people is in Roman records in the 1st or 2nd century AD. And they have always been settled in parts of Eastern Europe, more or less. And they were an Indo-European people. They used to worship the thunder god, the rain god, Parjanya, Perun, they used to call him, and so on. Now, So they settled in parts of Eastern Europe. Then there was this constant migration that happens. The Huns came from the east, and also they were the Slavs were forced to move westwards and on. Then what you had is that there were these Vikings. You know the Vikings, those warriors from Scandinavia. So they kind of took over the leadership of the Slavic peoples just briefly. They were called the Varangians. Their leader was called what was his name? Olaf, Prince Olaf, I believe his name was, or Prince Oleg, I think Prince Oleg, and his father was Rurik, the leader of the Kievan Rus. So the Rus, the name of the Russians, it comes from these Varangians, these Vikings who called themselves Rus, and they became the leaders. And that's how the Slavic peoples of present day Russia, their ancestors came to be called Rus, and they were in present day Ukraine, Muscovy, etc., all that. And then for some time, what you had is that the Russians were under the Mongols. After the expansion of Genghis Khan, the Mongols took over Russia, and for quite some time, a couple of centuries at least, they were under Mongol rule. Then again, they became independent. Now, this territory called Ukraine, it has been it has been settled by Scythians, Alans, Huns, Bulgars, Mongols, Tatars, all these people. In the 14th century, what is now Ukraine was called Little Russia. Now, in the 17th and 18th century, Russians, Serbs, Greeks, etc., settled there, and they called this region Novorossiya, which means New Russia. And later it came to be known as Ukraina or Okrania, which means the Russian borderland. All right. So it's always been a Russian territory. This is history. There is nothing controversial about this. It's always been Russian territory. Now, the Ukrainian language, it emerged out of this region at some time. It is just another Slavic language. You can consider it to be a dialect of Russian in some way. It's very similar and so on. Sounds the same, and it's more or less the same, right? So that is the history going back a few centuries. Now, after the 1917 Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks came to power. Lenin, Stalin, all these people, Trotsky, and so on. Trotsky was taken care of earlier. That doesn't matter. So the USSR started taking shape at that time. Socialism, communism, all that. And these various so-called Soviet republics were organized in a variety of ways just for administrative purposes. So a lot of Russian territory was given over to what is now called Ukraine. Ukraine was an administrative division within the USSR. And the constitution of the USSR was such that technically each Soviet socialist republic within the USSR was like a nation on its own technically, and they had the right technically to secede. But under somebody like Stalin, even the dream of seceding out of the USSR could not occur. So it was a very centralized state, the USSR. Now, what Stalin did was he added some Russian territory to the to Ukraine for administrative purposes. After the Second World War, it was, I think, Khrushchev who added Crimea, which is a Russian territory, to Ukraine for administrative purposes. And the situation went on until the dissolution of the USSR. So what happened is that earlier you had very powerful leaders like Stalin and so on. Later on, as is the story with every empire, every great state, you have weaker leadership, and so cracks begin to be visible. So what happened is that the subsequent Soviet leadership was not very good at managing the economy. The nation became decrepit and so on. In the 1980s, cracks began to be very visible. The economy was in a shambles. The West was doing very well, and so on. And then Mikhail Gorbachev comes into the picture. If you look at the way they regard him even today in Russia, it's not very nicely. They don't think very highly of Mikhail Gorbachev because he presided over the destruction of the USSR. He is in some corners even alleged to be a Western agent. So what happened is that in 1989-91, in that period, the USSR disintegrated, and the leadership was so weak that all these republics declared independence. One of them was Ukraine. Ukraine became independent. And the deal was that whatever foreign debt, external debt the USSR owed to other countries, Russia would take care of that. But in exchange for that, all these breakaway republics, they would hand over all the USSR national assets to Russia, including nuclear weapons, right? So that was the deal. And Ukraine became one of these independent republics, independent nations. They handed over the nuclear warheads, weapons, etc., and they kept on getting lots of aid subsidies from Russia. So it's about in the last 20 years or so, they've got about $250 billion of subsidized aid from the USS, from the Russians, and so on. So that is the situation. Now, what happened is that typically, so until 2013, you had Volodymyr Zelensky, who was the president in Ukraine. Now, in 2013, 2014, there was this Euromaidan revolution that happened in Ukraine. So this is essentially, what happened is that the elected president, I'm sorry, it was not Volodymyr Zelensky, it was Viktor Yanukovych who was the president. Sorry, so that's a correction. So this guy who was the elected president, he was deposed. He was forcibly removed. He was ousted in this revolution, and a pro-EU, pro-NATO government was installed by early 2014, by February 2014. So this is essentially a pro-NATO regime change. It's essentially a coup. Vladimir Putin sees this as a coup. And a former actor and comedian, Zelensky, became the president of Ukraine. So this happened sometime in February 2014. And immediately, by the end of February 2014, what you see is that there is this emergence of pro-Russian unrest in Ukraine, especially in the east and the south parts of Ukraine, which have lots of people, a majority that are Russian speaking, and they identify themselves as Russians, the population. And even if you look at the whole of Ukraine today, what you find is that there are lots of Russian speaking people who consider themselves to be ethnic Russians, not Ukrainians. And the funny thing, the curious thing, is that Ukraine has not held a census for more than 20 years for some reason, because then these demographics will become very apparent. Right. So these are just facts. Okay. I'm not taking this side or that side. I'm just telling you what, the way I see it, the way I read it. So what you have in 2014, February onwards, is there is unrest, right? There is this resistance towards what's happening in Ukraine. So in March 2014, Crimea was annexed by Mr. Putin, which, like I said, was traditionally a Russian territory. And then there is this war in this region. It's called the Donbas region, which is east and south Ukraine, right? So in 2014 itself, two independent republics were proclaimed: the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic. So this is the eastern part of Ukraine and the southern part of Ukraine, right? Southeast and so on. So that's what happened. So these two republics declared their independence. Obviously, they were aided and abetted by the Russians, right? Then you had a referendum that happened in 2014 itself, Donbas status referendum, which sought to legitimize the establishment of these two republics, right? Then you had all this fighting that was happening between the pro-Russian militia and the Ukrainian forces. Some terrible things happened in 2014. This Malaysian Airlines flight 17 was shot down. They thought it was something else, and it was a horrible thing which happened. So that was a terrible tragedy that happened at this time. Then in September 2014, there was the first Minsk agreement between the warring sides, between the Russians, the Ukrainians, and some other mediators. It was a 12-point peace plan in September 2014. Within a couple of months, it was totally like it collapsed. By early 2015, the whole thing collapsed, because in November 2014, you had the general elections that were held in the Donbas region, which elected the chief executives and the parliaments of this region. And by early 2015, by January, February, this agreement collapsed. Then in February, they started the whole thing again. Then you had the Minsk II protocol, Minsk II agreement, which is, I believe, a 13-point agreement, which was signed, and it has never been implemented, because the last 2 points about special status that should be given to Donbas, it is interpreted in different ways by both the sides. So there's never been agreement on that, and there's been this conflict which is going on. It has never become a hot war, but there is this insurgency, this conflict, artillery, fighting, shooting, all that's been going on since 2015, since February and so on. Now what happened is in 2021, there was an escalation of this fighting, and that's continued until right now, until 2022. And of late, there's been this big Russian military buildup on the Ukrainian border, on the eastern part of Ukraine. And what's also interesting is in December 2021, December last year, the president of Belarus essentially told Russia that he was willing to accommodate nuclear weapons again on Belarusian territory. And in December, I think it's in December, the constitution of Belarus was very subtly amended, which essentially says that Belarus is no longer bound by the principle of neutrality and all that. So what you can interpret this to be is that Belarus is now technically or de facto annexed by Russia. That's what's happened. Belarus is no longer independent in the truest sense of the word. It is now essentially part of the Russian orbit. So Belarus is now Russian, Crimea is Russian, Donbass is Russian, and the Russians are eyeing more territory, and they have justified it with proper historical precedent. Mr. Putin last night gave a long speech, nearly 1 hour speech, in which he laid out the entire history of what happened. He blamed Vladimir Lenin for the way the constitution was created and the way the powers were given to all the USSR republics, which in a sense is correct what he said. So that's what's happening. What happened is that, see, in Ukraine, we had this weak government that was installed by the American-led NATO, which was a weak government. Wherever you don't have sufficient power, there's a power vacuum, and power is an expansionist force. It's like pressure. So where there is a power vacuum, some other power will come and take over. So that's what's happening in Russia. The Russians always have, for the past 20 years, they have lamented the fact that their great USSR broke up, and that the fact that the NATO has been able to take various Russian orbit states into their orbit. And I think there was an agreement that was signed, or it was agreed upon between Russia and NATO, that Ukraine, Belarus, etc. would never be incorporated into NATO. And now that agreement was on the verge of being broken, and that's why all this is happening. And there's also a China angle, because we are witnessing the systemic coordination of activities now between Russia and China. So, see, as we know, Russia is no longer a great power from the economic perspective. They are no longer even in the top 10 economies in the world, but they are a military superpower. They have the largest nuclear weapons arsenal in the world. They also have an enormous military strength, which is the legacy of the USSR, which, as we know, was a real superpower. So although the Russians may not be an economic superpower, they are a genuine military superpower, and the Chinese are willing to bankroll them. Right. The Chinese need an attack dog in Europe. Well, I would not like to use the word dog, but you know what I mean. So they are using Russia essentially as their enforcers in Europe. And so these two nations, I would not call it an alliance, but there is certainly a sort of cooperation and coordination that's happening right now. So from Mr. Putin's perspective, this is a short to medium term game, the coordination with China. Because if you look at the history of China and Russia, there is a very complex and interesting history right there also. In the 1960s, the USSR nearly nuked China, and they were prevented from doing so by the US. And that is where the rise of China begins, because the Americans brought China into their orbit. So it's a very complex history. But China and Russia had a very terrible land dispute, the kind of land dispute India and China have today. There was fighting. There was the Ussuri River clashes in the 1960s. Lots of people died in that, so soldiers from both sides. The Russians prevailed. Later on, there was a boundary demarcation agreement. But the Russians, they regard that border dispute as not closed, but dormant. The Chinese will reopen it at the appropriate time. So China and Russia are not natural allies. They are natural adversaries. But right now, for the time being, because their national interests align for the moment, they are cooperating. So that's the situation where we are in right now.
Got it. Yeah, I think the one sentence I have to highlight, which has been my big geopolitical learning from you over all these podcasts we've done, is that there are no real friends in geopolitics. There are just alliances that suit your situation, which is actually the question I wish to ask you, sir. We understand that China's interests right now are to be that global superpower, because they are already the economic superpower in the world. So when it comes to Russia in this whole situation, is it money as the underlying force? Is it their own historical pride as the underlying force? Is it geographical expansion, which will then lead to, say, money or say power? Like, what is the actual underlying reason they're doing this anyway?
So there's a multiplicity of reasons for this. First of all, there is the historical grievance that the territory that has been historically Russian has been taken away from the Russians because of the weak leadership of the 1980s, 1990s. So all this territory that was historically Russian territory was given away. Lots of Russian-speaking people, lots of ethnic Russians are stranded in other so-called other countries right now. So Mr. Putin seeks to reunify that. Mr. Putin I would imagine, has a big ego for a man who commands such a large country. So I think what he said, the speech that he gave yesterday, he was laying out his vision and plans for Akhand Russia. That's essentially what he is seeking, right? So that is one thing. Secondly, the Russians seek to rise again. They were a superpower. Today they have been destroyed in the economic sense. Mr. Yeltsin systematically destroyed the Russian economy in the 1990s. Mr. Yeltsin totally disintegrated the Russian economy systematically. It was not it was not something that was like it was done on purpose, right? So Mr. Putin has stopped the bleeding first of all, and then he has revived Russia to a certain extent. But Russia is still economically weak, but they are militarily powerful. So that's where this relationship with China comes in. China is flush with money. China, as you say, it seeks to become a global superpower. Right now, it is the world's second largest economy. I would not consider China to be a superpower. The definition of a superpower is that it's a country that controls the global systems, the financial system, the economic system, the institutions, and also it has the ability to intervene militarily anywhere in the world at 60 minutes notice. So that's a superpower. The Chinese don't control the global systems. The global currency is still the US dollar. The IMF, the World Bank, etc., are all still controlled by the US. Even the UN, to some extent, is still controlled by the US. The Chinese have infiltrated it a lot. UN, WHO, UNESCO, etc. So they are doing it. They're trying their best. They aim to replace the US and displace them by maybe 2050. That is the great hope that they have. That is the great Chinese dream. That is the dream of Mr. Xi Jinping. So he will use everything at his disposal to achieve this, including a temporary relationship with Russia. When the time is right, he will not want Russia to rise too much, obviously, because that becomes a huge threat for him. They have a long common border. So that right now we are seeing a tripartite, we are seeing a slow bipolarization of the world. So typically your geopolitical commentators will say that we are seeing a multipolar world right now. That is a transient phase. The 2020s are a decade of great and very rapid change. So we are very rapidly seeing this bipolarization of the world. On the one hand, we have the dragon bear, which is Russia and China. On the other hand, we have the US-led global system in which India is still to a large extent a part of it, the Quad and all those things. But we are also quite close to Russia. We are not close to China, of course, but we are part of the Shanghai Agreement, Shanghai Cooperation, SCO organization, the BRICS also. So India is kind of somewhere in between. Our great threat is China. Our great ancient old relationship is with Russia. Our emerging relationship is with the Americans and everybody else. So India is kind of caught in the middle, but I think India is playing an interesting game right now. Because if you see, yesterday the entire thing was announced by Mr. Putin. Then the United Nations Security Council, it held a meeting and many nations condemned this. India refused to condemn the Russian actions. India said that all parties should ensure there is no violence and try to resolve this amicably, peaceably, with negotiations and talks and all that. That sort of statement was made by India. And you see this outpouring on Twitter of all the think tank experts, all the disposable freelance minions of the US State Department who are pouring scorn on India, that India is not sticking to principles. By what principles? What principles is India supposed to stick to? The only principles in geopolitics is your self-interest. My national interest is paramount. That's the only principle I'm going to follow. Because see, when the Pakistanis were bleeding India, slice by slice by slice, did the Americans impose sanctions on the Pakistanis? No, they funded the Pakistanis. It was American money that was used to bleed India. The Americans used Pakistan as a proxy to bleed India for decades, right? When the Chinese, when the 2008 Mumbai attacks happened, did they condemn Pakistan? Did they take the name of Pakistan and condemn Pakistan? No, they did not. Did they impose sanctions on Pakistan? Nothing. When the Chinese did the Daulat Beg Oldie incident, the Galwan incident, they killed Indian soldiers, did the world condemn that? Was any sanctions passed on China? Nothing. So why does India need to take their side when the same thing is happening over there? India should adopt the same policy of staying neutral. This is not our fight. I don't have a horse in this race. You guys take care of it. We will urge peace and calm and negotiations. Don't fight. That's all we should say. So that's the stand India is taking. And the West especially is very, very upset with that, especially the US. So that's where we are right now.
Uh, would love for you to shed some light on the US's interests in this whole game. Is it purely the fact that the dragon bear is getting more powerful? Is there even deeper interests?
So the US, the last 30 years, has been the sole superpower after the collapse of the USSR, which one could say that they engineered, right? So they won. They won the Cold War, and everybody thought, yeah, now all the world will be peaceful, everything will be fine, all the problems will go away. No problem ever went away. Now the Chinese are rising. They seek to displace and replace the US. So for the Americans, it is a mortal threat. The US has a very simple doctrine. It's called the Blitzer doctrine. It's a very obscure and less known doctrine. And the doctrine says that any nation, if it rises above a certain threshold, it has to be destroyed. Don't allow any nation to even think of becoming a threat or a competitor to the US. So you see this, the entire history of the 20th and 21st century, all the numerous interventions the Americans have done in various places. You can see this in action and in motion. So the entire Middle East crisis, which has been going on for decades, they have kept it going, they've kept it churning and so on. Now, so they see the Chinese as a big mortal threat. And in the last 20 years, after the rise of Mr. Putin, even the Russians have risen again, and they are also a challenge to the US, because the US, it wants the whole of Europe to come under their orbit. So everything should be a part of NATO, including Ukraine, including all these former Soviet republics. And the Russians see that as a huge challenge. They will not allow it. It is a red line that they will not allow the Americans and NATO to cross. So it's a tussle. The Americans seek global hegemony. There should be no competitor, no rival at all. We want a unipolar world. That's what the Americans have always sought. But in the last 20, 30 years, they messed it up. Because if you look at the US today, it is a deeply divided nation. There is no leadership today in the US. I hate to say this. I hate to say it openly. But if you look at the last 10, 20 years, where's the leadership? People make fun of George W. Bush, but at least he did something, some action. He fed the military industrial complex monster. He did a war in Iraq and all. So he took some kind of affirmative, positive action from the US side. But after him, Mr. Obama has bombed civilians, bombed helpless people. He has given big speeches, but where's the leadership? Speeches and slogans don't make leaders. It's actions that make leaders. So the US is suffering from a lack of leadership. Trump was in office. He was never in power. He was a lame duck president for 4 years. The political class was shocked at his rise, and they never allowed him to do anything at all, to do anything substantial. So Obama did nothing. Trump was not allowed to do anything. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying it how it is. And now you have, who we have. We have Mr. Biden. So and we also have Kamala, Mr. Biden and Kamala Harris. You call that leadership? There's no leadership. So the US is a deeply, deeply divided nation. There are all these internal conflicts that are raging in the US. The race conflict is raging. The class conflict is raging. The rich versus poor divide is widening. It is horrific. You have homelessness rampant in the US. People are pooping on the streets. The US is declining. It's going backwards, backwards, backwards. It's like the decline of the Roman Empire that we are watching. But they still have this vast military machine and economic machine. So they are a declining culture, civilization. It's never been a civilization, sorry. They are a declining empire. But they still have the remnants of power. So they are fighting back against the dying of the light. That's what we are seeing. And they also have the entire big data and all that. So they are using that to fight back against China. So what we are seeing is this clash right now. We could call it a clash of civilizations or a clash of two hegemons who both seek primacy in the globe. So that's what we are seeing. The Americans want global hegemony, but now they are too weak to do that without allies. And that's why they are seeking an Indo-Pacific alliance. They are trying to create the Quad. They have the NATO, which is still there. And they are very deeply upset that India, even though it's part of the Quad, is not supporting them where NATO is concerned, and so on and so forth. So this is the wrenching apart of the global order that we are witnessing. We are witnessing, it looks like we are witnessing the beginnings of the end of Pax Americana, the American hegemony in the world. And God knows where we are going to go. If it continues this way, the Chinese will rise and we will have Pax Sinica. The Chinese will take over the world, which in my opinion is not going to be a great thing. So it's still too early to say, but it looks like the US is declining. The Chinese with the help of the Russians, are rising. India is somewhere in the middle. India is still a small country, small economy. 3 billion is not big enough. It is still just a medium-sized economic power. Once India reaches the $10 trillion threshold, trillion, not billion. Once India reaches $10 trillion threshold of GDP, that's when India will be a sizable power, and it will be able to make its opinions heard, and it will be able to shape its neighborhood at least. So this is going to be a very, very interesting decade. Anything could happen, essentially.
Will World War III happen in this decade?
That's a very interesting question. Nobody wants World War III. See, if you look at the US, they have so many interests all across the globe. They have so many systems they've put in place. They've put supply chains in place. They've got so many alliances in place, so many investments in so many countries. If a war happens, they will lose all that. So they don't want that to happen. It's going to be a terrible financial and economic blow for them, any kind of war. Similarly, for the Chinese, they have built up so much since the 1980s. They have their economy has grown like multiple times, right? I mean, in the 1990s, their economy was the same place as India's is today, 3 billion. Today, it is 17-18 billion dollars, 6 times, right? So they have grown so much. They have built so much of their country. If there is a war, they stand to lose everything. So they don't want a war. The Americans don't want a war. The Russians don't want a war. We also don't want a war. We are a growing economy. We don't want that to be disrupted. We already had 3 lost years, the pandemic. So nobody wants a war. So today, in the 21st century, wars will be fought by other means. You will have cyber warfare, you will have information warfare, you will have disinformation warfare, misinformation warfare, social media warfare, propaganda, and very diplomatic warfare. Sanctions can be imposed on economies and destroy economies, like the Americans have done to Iran and so on, Yemen, etc. So these are the means by which countries would prefer to wage the wars. They don't want kinetic warfare, which causes destruction, because everybody has a lot to lose, right? Nobody wants a war. So I don't see a large-scale war erupting unless somebody messes up badly and miscalculates badly. So what we are seeing right now in the Donbas region is a very calculated move by Mr. Putin. He has been putting the pieces of the chessboard in motion, in place, since at least 2014, at least. Most likely a few years before that. So what he has done yesterday, he has been planning for a decade. This was the end goal, and this is still not the end goal. There is more to come. So, but it is done in a way that it doesn't cross anybody's red lines, anybody's thresholds, and there is no actual warfare, actual country versus country warfare. You have sub-national warfare. You have these insurgencies and civil wars and all. That is okay. That will fine. Nothing more than that. So there are certain thresholds that nobody wants to cross. So I personally hope there is no large-scale war. I don't see it happening unless somebody miscalculates badly. People do miscalculate. If you look at the record of history, it's littered with examples of miscalculations, which we have seen in the 20th century, and we may even see now. One hopes it doesn't happen, but if Mr. Xi Jinping does some stupid misadventure, or if he is kicked out of power by the by the Chinese Communist Party's Politburo, if there's a coup, or if something goes wrong somewhere else, if the Americans miscalculate, there could be a war, which is something we don't want, because there are nuclear weapons on each side. Everybody has them now. So it would not be a good thing for the world. So I hope it doesn't happen. I think it's very unlikely to happen, but there's a small chance somebody could mess up.
Why did you say that all the geopolitical observers are very kind of restless right now? Is it because every small move is being observed, and are you trying to predict what will happen going forward? And I mean, the supplemental question here is, did any of the geopolitical observers predict this move?
Yes. So they have been. So we know that this military buildup by the Russians has been increasing since late 2021. So it's been a number of months that this is happening, and you could see something's going to happen, because this kind of buildup, it will either lead to a war or some kind of big event. So everybody was wondering when it will happen, and some geopolitical observers had predicted it will happen at the end of the Winter Olympics, which was 20th of February. So until that time, they will keep on building the pressure, and Russia and the Chinese don't want anything to go wrong before that. Once the Olympics are over in Beijing, then something may happen. And that's precisely what happened. So that's why, and what happened yesterday is big moves. It's not small incremental moves. It's like the release of the big pressure. Like in a tectonic zone, you have these small earthquakes that keep happening, and then there's a big earthquake that releases all the pressure. So that's the kind of thing that happened yesterday. Of course, there could be more aftershocks coming in. So that's why everybody is awake. Nobody is sleeping. Everybody is awake for the past 24, 48 hours, because people are busy making predictions. People are busy saying, I was right. I said this, I said that. And people are trying to predict what's going to happen in the next week, next month, next year, that sort of thing. So it's a time of feverish activity among this community, the geopolitical think tank people and the observers and forecasters. So some people did predict. There is a lady called Velina Chakarova. She actually tweeted this last year, December or something, that until 20th of February, there'll be nothing. But after that, anything could happen. And most likely some action will happen in the Donbas region. So she has been proven to be right. So that's the kind of thing that's going on right now.
There's unlimited questions in my head, sir, but I wanted to make this a crisp piece. That's why I'll ask you one last question for today's conversation. What is your prediction for the next year from a geopolitical perspective? What's going to happen, according to you?
Uh, Apart from this, what we have just witnessed, I don't see any major geopolitical action happening in the next 1 year. I think this decade is going to be very interesting. Lots of things may change, even borders may change in this decade. This year, I think the big action has happened. Maybe there'll be some more military action happening in Ukraine. Maybe the two republics have already been kind of integrated in some way under Russia, but the Russians may expand further westwards into the other parts of Donbas that are still held by the Ukrainians. So that could happen. So you could see the territory that's held by the Ukrainians may be reduced by half. That is a possibility. So that could happen. And you could see the further strengthening of the Russia-China relationship, the Dragon Bear relationship. You will see a lot of pushback coming against India from the West, because India has remained neutral in this thing. So they'll be very unhappy about this. You could also see a strengthening of the Quad alignment in case China makes some moves now, because the Chinese are desperate to take back Taiwan. I am not saying it will happen this year. Maybe it could if they feel the time is right. But if the Chinese take over Taiwan, it's going to be game on in the Indian Ocean, because their pressure point will be relieved over there. Then they'll be able to send their ships into the Indian Ocean and start squeezing India. And India has already thought of this, because India is developing some very, very frightful weapon systems to deal with exactly such an eventuality. So we are not just developing it; we are already testing these weapons. These are missile developed torpedoes that can take out ships from more than 1,000 kilometers away. Ships and submarines also. So that's the kind of weaponry that India is developing, because our navy is not that extensive right now. But if a foreign navy comes into our strategic backyard, we can take them out with pinpoint accuracy with these new weapon systems. So that's what India is doing. So this year, I don't see a lot of very substantial geopolitical developments happening, but it's going to be substantial this decade for sure. So I can't make any concrete predictions, because I can't think of anything that could certainly for sure happen. But we are going into bipolarity. We are already in the middle we are already in the start of Cold War 2.0. We are in Cold War 2.0, and the world is going to become further bipolarized. So we're going to have one pole and another pole. The Chinese and the Russians with everybody who wants to be with them against the old order. So India is kind of in the old order right now, because right now it serves our interests the best to side with the US and the old order. So that's where we are right now.
What will be the outcome of the West basically being pissed off with India because of this whole situation and India's neutral stance?
They will try and impose some costs on India. Maybe they will use Pakistan as a stick to beat India with. Some things could happen. Right now, there's not much they can do also, because they need India in the Indo-Pacific. India controls the entire Indian Ocean region. India dominates the Indian Ocean region. India, if a conflict happens in the future, India will have to be used as a staging base for any conflict with China because of the geographical region. India is a very massive, it's the only possible counterweight to China in Asia. So there's not much they can do against India also, but they are right now going after Dr. S. Jaishankar on social media and all that. So that sort of thing is happening and all that. But in the long run, India will be a massive player in the Quad and in any Indo-Pacific alliance against China. So I don't think a lot can be done against India by the West, but they are quite pissed off for sure because we have stayed neutral and they deserve it. They did not deserve our support.
Abhijit Chavda, sir, thank you for this very urgent last minute request of a podcast. Always learning from you, sir. And next time we hope to host you in person and talk a little bit more about everything that's happening at this moment in time.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. It's always great to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Amazing, sir. Hey guys, so that was the episode for today. I intend on doing a lot more current affairs based episodes. So if you guys want us to address any more topics, if you all want us to break down this topic even further, please tell us on our social media, tell us in the comments section. And I hope you all enjoyed this particular episode. Make sure you follow TRS on Spotify. We're a Spotify exclusive, which means that every episode is available on Spotify 48 hours before it's available anywhere else in the world. Abhijit Chavda, of course, is going to return to the Ranveer show. We're planning on doing a lot with him this year. We're planning on doing a lot of current affairs related topics this year. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I sincerely hope you share it with all your friends. Let's build a more aware world together. Thank you.